Okay. Now, beginning with the first of those three wars, the Texas-Mexican War, and also continuing with the previous lecture on U.S. expansion during the first third of the 19th century. What else were the precursors leading up to the Texas-Mexican War? Well, a lot of it begins in 1819 when, at this point, it was still Spain. Texas was still part of Spain in 1819, right before Mexico gains its independence. And so Spain made an agreement or made an offer to people from the United States to move to Texas. And in Texas, they would get cheap land. They would get land for 25 cents for every 2.5 acres. And so then people from the United States started immigrating to Texas, which in 1819 was still part of New Spain. And so US citizens were welcomed to Texas from 1819 to 1829 when Mexico became independent in 1821. Mexico honored that agreement that Spain had, or that offer that Spain had made to US citizens. Mexico continued to honor it, and so it continued. But in 1829, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, Mexico abolished slavery, and this put Mexico, the Mexican government, and the US citizens that were moving to Texas at odds, because most of those US citizens moving to Texas were US citizens who were slave owners looking for places to expand slavery to. Initially, they made an exception for US citizens in Texas to be able to continue to have some slavery. I also wanted to mention that this war, the Texas-Mexican War, is one of the most contested subjects of history, one of the most debated topics in US history, up there with the Civil War. And so there's a lot of this that is debated. But at any rate, US citizens are welcomed for 10 years. At the end of those 10 years, Mexico abolishes slavery. The year after that, Mexico passes a law to stop continued immigration to Texas from the United States. On the eve of the Texas-Mexican War in 1835, people from the US now outnumbered Mexican citizens 4-1. And many of those US citizens, because in 1819 or in 1821, the US citizens that were moving to Texas, they had to follow the rules of New Spain and then the Mexican government. It included things like becoming citizens of Mexico, conducting legal procedures in Spanish, and recognizing Roman Catholicism as the official religion of the country. But after 1830, US citizens that moved to Texas were doing so illegally. And so the majority of the people defending the Alamo in 1836 were illegal immigrants from the US in Mexico fighting to take a piece of Mexico. Now, a lot of what I'm covering today is a summary of what was covered in the documentary that you watched, I think last week or maybe the previous class for the documentary, The Alamo, by the History Channel. And so there's a lot of repeated or reinforced information. And there was also, I mentioned in the documentary, you learned about all the filibustering expeditions that happened in Texas prior to this. I think the Texas-Mexican War is the fifth and successful filibustering expedition. But there was also evidence of U.S. interest in Texas. For example, in 1826, John Quincy Adams offered $1 million to Mexico for Texas. And then in 1829, President Andrew Jackson offered $5 million. And then again, putting these stories together, when Santa Anna was president of Mexico and he rewrote the Constitution and took a conservative turn toward centralization, giving more power to the national government, taking away a degree of states' rights, having more power for the president himself. All these things further put the Mexican government at odds with the Texans. All right, so the Texas-Mexican War is in 1836. We're introduced to some of the myths of the Alamo. One of them is that it was a massacre, just a one-day massacre. And that is, only acknowledging kind of the final battle and then the outcome. But it doesn't bring attention to the fact that it was a 2-week siege. And during that siege, they were warned, and even though they laid siege to it, they allowed people to come in and out, at least, not, how do I say this? People were able to come in and out, and it's believed that Santa Anna was allowing this to happen, even though they were laying siege to it and that they were bombarding it. And so, they were given warning what law they were breaking. They were being told that there was going to be no quarter. They let, any women, any non-combatants, women, children, and slaves to leave before the final battle. That is, if they wanted to and were allowed to leave. So yes. Then another one of the myths has to do with this being a war for freedom versus tyranny. And I remember going to San Antonio, Texas, to go visit kind of what's there from the Alamo today. And that is totally how they describe it. It was about freedom. They show you a documentary that says that it was a battle for freedom, a war for freedom, as opposed to tyranny. And there is some truth to that, right? Santa Anna did turn conservative and take more power in the presidency. From the Texan perspective, they would say that he was a dictator, and and he did lessen states' rights. And so in that sense, they can claim to be fighting for freedom. However, what it doesn't acknowledge is that, again, these were filibusters. These were people going to a territory of a country that didn't belong to the country they're citizens of. And they were doing what they had been doing throughout the 19th century, militarily taking control of a place, saying, hi, we're bringing you freedom, and you're now free and independent, and we're going to be in charge. And then another aspect of that it's not acknowledging is that these were primarily people that were fighting for the freedom to own slaves in Texas, which is the biggest issue they had with Mexico, is that they were no longer allowed to have slaves. And they also weren't allowed to move there anymore. They were just, they outnumbered everyone else 4-1. Another one of the myths is when it's portrayed as a race war, a war between Mexicans and US citizens. When in fact, there were also Tejanos, Mexican Texans, that sided with the US citizens and wanted to break away from Mexico, wanted Texas to become independent. This reminds me of when I went to visit the Alamo, and I found out that, so my last name is Licon, my mother's last name is Esparza, and at the Alamo, there was an Esparza with Santa Ana shooting at the defenders, and there was an Esparza inside the Alamo shooting out at the Mexican army. And so this also brings up, how for Mexico, this is kind of similar to a civil war. A war internally about a part of its country that wants to break away and wants to break so that it can keep slavery. A lot of parallels with the US Civil War. Then we get to the myths with regard to the heroes of the Alamo. William Barrett Travis. Travis was the person defending the Alamo who was in charge of the people who had military training. And so they would have called them the regulars. And so they're the people that have military training. He's their leader. And Travis was at the Alamo with his slave, a slave named Joe, and he would have his slave help him fight. He basically had 2 rifles or muskets, and he would have Joe reloading one while Travis was shooting the other, and then they'd switch. And so yeah, that is Travis. Travis, was brave. He was up at the top of the Alamo shooting out. But that also made him one of the first people to die once the battle began. At which point, his slave Joe, puts down his arms, goes inside the Alamo and just waits for everything to be done, for the fighting to be over. Once it's over, Joe is allowed to walk away from the Alamo by the Mexican army. Then we have James Bowie. Bowie was the person in charge of the volunteers. These were the people that didn't have previous military training. James Bowie, he was well known for being an Indian fighter, for fighting and killing Native Americans. And this knife, till this day, is called a Bowie knife, named after him. And Bowie, he came to Texas because after the Louisiana Purchase, he made fraudulent land grants where he claimed that Spain had given him millions of acres of land in land grants. And by the 1830s, they figured out that his land grants had been forged, were falsified, were not real. And so then he fled the US and went to Texas. During the battle of at the Alamo, from so there were like Mexican soldier accounts that said that that they found Bowie hiding in a room, maybe even said like hiding under the bed, kind of portraying him as a coward. What they didn't know from the other side of the story is that Bowie became very sick. And so at the time of the final battle, when the Mexican soldiers stormed the Alamo, he was bedridden. He was just sick in bed, and kind of did the best he could once they came to his bedroom, or the bedroom where he was staying. Then we have Davy Crockett. David Crockett was one of the most famous people in the United States at that time. He's been considered the first media celebrity in US history. He was famous for being a frontiersman, a person that lived out in the frontier, interacting with Native Americans and, just living out in the frontier, kind of like the Wild West. And so, yeah, he was very famous for that. And they would, the things they would say about him remind me of many of you might not be familiar with this person, but in the 1980s, when I was a kid, there was an actor that was really popular named Chuck Norris. And Chuck Norris, they just say all kinds of kind of superhuman things about him, and they're funny. They're like the memes of the 80s, and people would wear t-shirts with funny memes of Chuck Norris. And so they would say like, Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. They say all these like wild things about him. And that is similar to Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett could he could kill a man with a whisker. Like he would pull out a whisker from his beard and he could stab someone to death. He could kill a bear just with his grin, or his growl. Scare a bear to death. Davy Crockett could ride a lightning bolt. Just all these, kind of incredible superhuman things they would say about him. So that was the larger than life popularity of Davy Crockett. But kind of outside of that, in kind of more real life, Davy Crockett was a politician. He was a member of Congress, and at that time, he was trying to cash in on his popularity and become president of the United States. But when he ran for re-election, he lost that re-election. And so he figured his chances, if he couldn't win re-election to Congress, he was unlikely to win a national election for the presidency. And so he went to Texas in hoping that he would become president of Texas when it becomes independent. So he goes to the Alamo. He brings a lot of hope and energy. He was the most famous person there. And he is believed to have survived that battle. And in some historical accounts or how do I put this? In historical records, which don't mean that they're accurate, and in some movies, especially, like movies from the 1950s, he's portrayed as not surviving, but dying, valiantly till, he runs out of bullets. And then he turns his rifle around and starts hitting Mexican soldiers with the butt of his gun. He goes down fighting. A more likely thing that happened is that he did survive the battle, but he was one of a handful of people who survived the battle. But then Antonio Lopez de Santana ordered that those handful of survivors be executed. And so he was probably bayoneted to death. Bayonet is that knife on the front of old rifles. So yeah, that's Davy Crockett. So the Alamo is the battle we're most familiar with, and it's why is that? A number of reasons. One is that after this incident happened, newspapers throughout the United States brought attention to this battle. Remember, the Alamo was a call to arms of the people in the United States to go help these US citizens fight against Mexico. You know, get them money, get them weapons, and volunteer to go help them. And so remember, the Alamo was, that was its purpose of that expression, was to get people to go out and help. And newspapers throughout the country spread that message. After the Alamo, there was another incident at a place called Goliad. At Goliad, so at the Alamo, there were about 250 defenders. At Goliad, there were 350. And there, they did not fight against the Mexican army. They gave themselves up without a fight. And Antonio Lopez de Santana ordered all 350 executed. And so at the time, in addition to remember the Alamo, was also remember the Goliad. And in a way, the Goliad is a bigger, I don't know, what do you call that? A bigger injustice, a bigger, you know, because they should have been spared because they didn't even fight. And so, you know, it's possible that it caused even more outrage than the Alamo itself. So at the time, just as popular was Remember the Goliad as was Remember the Alamo. But now we don't remember the Goliad at all, even though it was kind of a bigger tragedy. But we do remember the Alamo. And why is that? I would say that it is because it is preferable for Texans to remember the people that are remembered the way that Davy Crockett was portrayed, you know, someone who went down fighting, not someone who gave themselves up without a fight. So I think it's more like how they wanted to remember it than, yeah. All right. Then we get to the Battle of San Jacinto. This is actually the most important battle of this war, not the Alamo. The Battle of San Jacinto is more important. Why? Because this is the battle that the Texans won and the battle that ended the war and gave them their independence. How did that happen? Well, Santana got overconfident. He ended up splitting his army into three parts, thinking that he had the Texans on the run. He had already defeated them at the Alamo. He executed them without a fight at Goliad, and now he figures he still has them on the run. And so he didn't anticipate that they would attack him. So Santana was at San Jacinto with 1/3 of his army, not expecting Sam Houston and the Texans and Tejanos to attack him, but that's exactly what happened. And I don't know, kind of in the Texan version of it, you know, they throw in the siesta, you know, it's like, you know, the Mexican army, you know, was having their siesta. And so then that's when we attacked them. And so it kind of brings in that stereotype of the lazy Mexican. But at any rate, they did surprise attack them. Whether they were in their siesta, I don't know. But so they surprise attacked them and they got revenge for the Alamo and the Goliad. They they set out to get revenge for those that have died in the previous two encounters. At the end of the Battle of San Jacinto, well, maybe not immediately after, but as a result of the Battle of San Jacinto, they caught and arrested Antonio Lopez de Santana himself. Santana was both the general and the general of the Mexican army and the president of the country. They captured him and they had him sign the Treaty of Velasco, where Santana agreed to leave Texas, to take his army with him, to stop fighting, and to acknowledge Texas independence. Santana does that. He signs the document, the Treaty of Velasco, ending the war. He takes his army south of Texas into the rest of Mexico. He goes back to Mexico City, and in Mexico City, Congress tells him, the president doesn't have the authority to sign away, give away its territory. Only Congress, Mexican Congress, has that authority. So Mexico never recognized the independence of Texas. The United States, on the other hand, immediately recognized Texas independence as a legitimate country. And so Texas was its own country for about 10 years. Now, I have the question here, why is it that we remember the Alamo? Why is it that we have that expression, remember the Alamo? I believe that stereotypes and even expressions like this, I think they serve a purpose. And I think if they didn't serve a purpose, then, sort of we forget about them. They don't continue to be used. And so, like I mentioned, in 1836, remember the Alamo was for the purpose of encouraging people to go support them and get revenge for the Alamo and the Goliad. But this expression did not go away after the Texas-Mexican War. It continued to be used throughout the 19th century, similar to that stereotype of the lazy Mexicans sleeping in the middle of the day, resting on a cactus or an adobe wall, with his hat covering him from the sun. I think it served to justify the taking of Texas, the taking of the land of individual Tejanos who had property in Texas after the Texas-Mexican War and after the Mexican-American War. And so, yes, it just fulfilled a purpose of justifying, remembering why, just justifying, helping to justify the taking of their land. You just have to remember what they did to U.S. citizens, mostly U.S. citizens, at the Alamo. But I'll conclude this this portion on the Texas-Mexican War by pointing out a bigger picture about war and what we're told to remember. I would argue, and you don't have to agree with me, but I would argue that for every war that we get involved with, the public is given something to remember. The public is given something to remember to serve as a reason for them to support the war, to be able to justify the war. And so you know, for the Tex-Mexican War, it was remember the Alamo. In the Spanish-American War that we'll learn about in a bit, it was the sinking of the USS Maine. For World War I, it was the sinking of the Lusitania. For World War II, it was Pearl Harbor. For Vietnam, it was the Tonkin Gulf incident. And for the War on Terror, it's 9/11. And so for every war that we get involved with, the public is told what to remember so that they will support the war. And yeah, again, you don't have to agree with me, but I think it's part of history that keeps repeating itself.